So, you said you were born in Tuskegee,
Yes,
raised in Atlanta,
yes,
went to college here at Tuskegee.
I did, yes.
What did you study in college?
I studied biology. I majored here in biology, and then I got a master's degree here in prostate cancer research.
Okay. Then where did you get your doctorate?
I went to University of Pittsburgh School of Medicine,
Okay, Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania.
Pennsylvania.
So, you grew up your whole life, spent your whole life up until what, about 22, 23 years old?
Yeah, right at 22.
In the South.
In the
And
South.
You go to
The North, which was a major change.
Culture shock.
Culture shock.
You've been around African American communities your whole life, I assume?
Afro American community, Afro American high school, Afro American college,
Yeah.
and then I had to transition to a majority
Okay. So,
institution.
alright, one thing I like to do is, why did you always stay around the African American community and go to HBCU for college?
Well, I think it's primarily being that my parents were from Tuskegee and the rich heritage of Tuskegee. When they moved to Atlanta, we moved into the African American neighborhood, and at that time, African Americans, particularly in the Atlanta area, actually were doing pretty well. And so I went to the local high school, and then being a Tuskegee native and having all of my family members graduate from Tuskegee,
Okay.
there was a logical choice for me to come back here and start my collegiate studies here at Tuskegee. So it was almost mandatory for our family.
What year was that?
I came to Tuskegee in 1994
Okay.
as an undergraduate freshman.
Okay. So you didn't leave 94 to 98 then?
I graduated in 98 with an undergraduate degree, and then about a year and a half later, I finished with a master's degree, and then I left here in 2001.
So your whole life you knew you were going to college?
I did. There was a struggle, like some African American males growing up. There was a struggle, but I have to thank my mother. My mother made sure. My mother always knew I was going to college.
You didn't know, but
I didn't know, but she knew.
How do you feel? How much do you feel the parents play a role in kids going to school? Is that the biggest role or the factor, do you think?
I think it's a large factor. I actually have a daughter in college, and again, it was a must for her to go to school, and so I think every individual is is different, but particularly for some kids that are on the fence as to whether they should go or not, the influence of their parents is really a driving factor. So I think parents play a major role.
Could you explain that research that you've done here?
Sure. So just to back up a little bit, breast cancer is a disease of multiple subtypes. All right. And so when a patient is diagnosed or with breast cancer, the first thing that is done is to determine which one of those subtypes that patient has, and then determination of those subtypes dictates the treatment outcome. All right. And so every patient can have different subtypes. And these subtypes also correlate with the prognosis. So if it's a really aggressive or less aggressive, all right, and it also determines what type of treatment, if you need a more aggressive treatment or not aggressive treatment. And so what physicians determine are the presence of hormone receptors, estrogen and progesterone. And so these are major drivers. Estrogen drives tumor progression. And then a growth factor receptor called HER2. All right, and those are all drivers. So when these hormones or growth factors are present, they drive aggression of the tumor. Just so happens that there is a form of breast cancer where these hormones aren't present, and they're called triple negative. All right, because they don't have the presence of any of these hormones, and we currently don't have any therapy for these because there's no targets. So if the hormone's not present, we can't give a hormone inhibitor to block it. All right, and so there's a lot of research being done on triple negative. But the way it turns out is that African American women typically have higher rates of triple negative, and this is the most aggressive form of disease compared to the less aggressive forms that are hormone positive, all right, and have treatment options. So what we aim to do was to help stratify that a little bit more. Is that can we really pinpoint why African American women have this so-called triple negative aggressive marker? So we look for the presence of a fourth marker called androgen receptor. All right. So androgen receptor is typically associated with male hormones or testosterone, unlike estrogen, which is typically associated with a female hormone. Now, both men and women do have estrogen and testosterone, but more in men is testosterone and less in women. But we look for the presence of this testosterone receptor in breast cancer patients. And what we found out is that looking at a large database, over 1,000 women, and African American women, it's really, sometimes these studies are very difficult because African American women, there are not a lot of samples. There are not a lot of samples donated. Caucasian women have more samples available to do research than African American. But we were able to pool a pretty good representative size of African American women, over 286 patients. And what we found is that over 81% of women had loss of this testosterone receptor. You say, well, why is that important? Well, that is important because loss of this other hormone, like loss of estrogen and progesterone, makes the tumor more aggressive, right? And so we found that loss of this hormone receptor in triple negative, we're now calling it quadruple negative for the fourth marker, is the most aggressive form of breast cancer. And as in triple negative, African American women tend to have more quadruple negative than even triple negative, or even the more favorable outcome subtypes. Well, we're looking now at the causes, so that's where we're going. This first study was saying, hey, this exists. Yeah. There's a need to study it further, to go deeper and to figure out the causes. So that's what we're working on now. That's the next phase, is to trying to understand some of the genes and possible genetics that are behind why we're seeing, one, the more aggressive form, but even the loss of all these hormones in African American women. But one thing we did find that was very favorable is that although there was a loss of these hormones in these women, there was an increase of immune regulatory genes. All right. So in today's world, the newest therapies that are being developed all target the immune system. All right. And so, people are typically comfortable and familiar with chemotherapy. We know the side effects of chemotherapy. But immunotherapy now is holding the promises that if we can turn on the body's immune system, the body can go and fight the tumor instead of trying to let the drug go in and find and then even so to limit some of these side effects. And so what we did find in this study is that these quadruple negative patients, and particularly African American women, had higher markers for this immune therapy compared to other races and breast cancer subtypes. So there is a promise that there could be a therapy available for these patients, all right, at the end of the day. So we found something that seemed to be a worse prognosis, but we found was hopefully a light at the end of the tunnel, that these patients could qualify for another emerging therapy called immunotherapy, and these patients would do better to hopefully limit the aggressiveness of the disease.
How dangerous is it to participate in a new type of immunotherapy type situation?
Well, so that's a very good question, and it's actually another a major factor in the generation of therapy specific for African American women, but any population. Just a little bit of facts. Most clinical trials are carried out on Caucasians. Okay, majority of clinical trials are carried out on Caucasian males. So there's typically an underrepresentation of minority patients, not just African American women, but any minority patient in these clinical trials. And so if a minority patient is not present, how do we know if a drug works or not? Yeah. Particularly from studies like ours and other people's in the field now understanding that the biology of a tumor is different by race, right? So if we're making drugs for a biology in one population, it's very hard to say it can be generalizable to others. So it's almost paramount that we have African Americans in these clinical trials so that we can generalize the therapies, or even be able to determine what drugs work in which populations, so that we can better treat the patients. Unfortunately, we don't have the answer to that question. But what we do have is what we call risk factors. So yes, diet is a risk factor. So we do know that diet, particularly high fatty food diet, is a risk factor for disease. It's not absolute, all right, but it is a risk factor. High alcohol intake, healthy lifestyle, exercising, eating fruits and vegetables. We all know these are risk factors, but we have not been able to, as you state, set find a set cause of a combination of those factors. And that also is affected because, back to the study that we did, is our genes are different.
Yeah.
So, if you have some genes, let's say a hereditary gene for cancer, and your diet is not necessarily what it should be, then you have a higher propensity for developing a disease and making it more aggressive. Now, if you don't have the genes, so therefore it may take longer or may not even manifest in your lifetime. All right? So all of these factors are now being considered, but we still don't have that pinpoint dot that we can say that these are, direct causes, but we do know what are risk factors for disease.
How cancerous is our environment, from drinking out of plastic cups, driving cars, going out on a regular day, putting on these different clothing with these different chemicals?
Sure.
How, on a day-to-day basis, how much do we come in contact with cancerous materials?
Well, unfortunately, we come in contact with cancer materials a lot. If you look at statistics, hereditary, that means genes that were passed on from your mother and father that are cancer, well-known cancer-causing genes, only represent about 15% of all cancers. The rest of them are what we call sporadic or spontaneously developed. So that means some factor in our environment was a cause of that, not a genetic mutation that was passed on from your parents. So I answer that more of in a science type of way, but that sort of answers your question that our environment plays a major role in disease. Yeah, again, science is not 100%, medicine is not 100%. But if you look at the numbers, though, the earlier that we can detect it, and a tumor, and the better the outcome. And if you can think about it, as if it's a cancer cell growing, and if it's small, and then it keeps growing, it gets bigger and bigger, it sort of gains momentum. It's hard to stop that momentum. If you got a ball rolling down the hill, if it's already halfway down the hill, it's really hard to stop that ball from rolling unless it was sort of small at the top and picked up speed. So, early detection, we do know is directly correlated with better outcomes, right? And that was another part of our study. So we found that utilizing this force marker, we could detect tumors in African American women 6 years earlier, right, than if you didn't use this fourth biomarker.
Detection. Means they have to go to the doctor.
They have to go to the doctor.
The importance of going to the doctor, and what ages should they consistently, and time, every 2 months?
Sure. So African American women and African American males, the American Cancer Association suggests that around age 40, women should start having mammograms. African American women probably should start a little earlier. All right, just given that there's a higher incidence, particularly of aggressive disease in African American women. However, before that, African American women should also start performing self breast exams at home. All right. So before we go to even to go to the doctor, there are exams again posted on websites like the American Cancer Association or the breastcancerassociation.org, where an African American woman or any woman can go in and learn how to perform a breast exam at home without going into the doctor. All right. So these are factors that are there and should be performed. Particularly, even a woman should start in the mid-20s. Okay. And while there's a lot of cases in mid-20s, the idea is to become familiar with the area, the tissue of your breast, so that if something abnormal comes, then you notice it immediately. Yeah, there's a change and there's something immediately. But I also will say that in African American women, there are a lot of these triple negative women being diagnosed in their mid to early 30s, which is a very alarming rate.
And that's in the 2000s. That's the new trend that's happening that wasn't present in the 90s.
Some of these trends, are also correlated with awareness. All right, mammograms being mandatory, covered by insurance, so people being able to listen to broadcasts like this and say, hey, I need to do a self breast exam. I go in, we catch it early, and now we can treat it. So some of these increase in incidence not necessarily to say they weren't there before, but because we're more aware, we have better technology, we're detecting them earlier and at a more increased rate.
So this is a new whole generation of the whole breast cancer situation. So you can't rely on stats from the 90s because...
Right. So when you look at the stats, we see increases in breast cancer incidence correlate with new interventions that have, or new technology that has been developed to help detect it. So we do see that in both in prostate and breast cancer.
Okay.
Yeah. Sure. So androgen is just basically testosterone. Okay. So it's the receptor for testosterone. Estrogen is another hormone, and the estrogen receptor is the receptor for it. And progesterone is just a third hormone.
Okay.
So these are all hormones that regulate primarily your secondary sex characteristics that make us men and women. Estrogen makes a woman. Testosterone makes a man, makes you have a beard, grow hair, Adam's apple. and so these are secondary sex characteristics that also drive tumor progression when cancers develop.
Okay. Cancer subtype, just one more time
Sure.
so people understand.
Yeah, they're just a subtype or variation of this expression or absence of expression of these hormone markers. Right? So if a patient comes in with estrogen receptor positive tumor, right? So that's one subtype. But if that patient is estrogen receptor negative, it's a different subtype. All right? Because we treat those patients differently. So there are therapies to block the estrogen from driving the tumor, making it more aggressive. So we treat that patient with an estrogen inhibitor if that patient has estrogen receptors present. But if that patient doesn't have estrogen receptor present, we don't use an estrogen inhibitor because it won't work, because it's not there, so you have to use another form of therapy. That's why we classify them in the subtype. And the subtype is just there to better treat the patient, to better understand what treatment should work and which one shouldn't. All right? Sounds great. Thank you.
I'll be back.
That was great. You had good questions.
I have to do my homework, man. I have to. Because I don't know much about